You're listening to the Pandemic Podcast. We equip you to live the most real life possible in the face of these crises. My name is Matt Botker, and I'm joined with my good friend, Dr. Stephen Kistler. Yep, not Dr. Mark Kistler, because that was totally blew that one. Epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health. How's it going, my friend?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Doing well. For those of you who are going to watch this either live or animated, here's my contribution to check that out. Happy Valentine's Day. Is that great?
That's amazing. I didn't know
That was
you could do that.
amazing. Yeah, there's so much I could do on this thing. So, how was your Valentine's Day, buddy?
It was good. Yeah, it was pretty quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you make a meal?
We ended up getting takeout from a restaurant here. It's like this really good
Nice.
Italian restaurant in the South End, which was great. It's the first time we tried it. So
That's awesome. And I'm curious, do you guys have any like allergies? Like, can you go full board Italian at your apartment, or do you have like gluten, dairy sensitivities?
thankfully, yeah, it's no concerns. So
What a gift. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well done. Well, our Valentine's Day was pretty good. The boys loved it. It felt like Christmas. Grammy and Papa mailed gifts, and they were fantabulous. And so if you guys can hear this, you might be able to hear this humming sound in the background because, of course, I'm in my basement. We have wood floors above, and one of the wonderful gifts was a little car. And they're driving it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth right now. So it's a little loud, but that's okay. That's why we're here. So it was good. It was fun. Happy President's Day for those of you guys who are presidents, I guess, all over around the country. So I had the day off. I'm not a president, but it was nice to have the day off and relax. So that's why we're coming to you a day late on Tuesday. We just wanted to hang out with the fam one extra day and then do this morning instead. I think that's good. Normal stuff. We love the reviews. So we got another great review about our professionalism and journalism. I don't have it in front of me, so that was really kind. It was funny. Whoever wrote that, it was like one of the best compliments, and then 3 out of 5 stars. We just thought it was funny. So whether they meant 3 out of the 5 stars or was it by accident, no big deal, but we love the comment about the humility and professional journalism. Greatly appreciate that. Patreon.com/pandemic podcast. So if you want to support us, as little as $5 a month can go a long way to help us keep this going, to make things more automated so we can get this out to you quicker. So we greatly appreciate that. You can do it on the website or just a one-time donation, PayPal, Venmo. That is all in the show notes for you. Okay, so let's just get rolling on a handful of things. You know, a couple weeks ago, we had a lot to chat about. We're kind of in another place now. I feel like news is a little bit slow. Other topics are kind of being dominating the media market. Now, see, that's my perspective because I look at just the media. You're probably looking at like scientific journals, all the. I'm like, oh, that's not me. I would get glazed over. And so my main outlet is a media. Has been a lot of stuff coming forward. But there's a handful of things I think that are worthy of talking about for this week. The first thing is, it's the same thing. I just want to get an update with you, and you can roll in a couple of things you mentioned before we started recording, and that is just dealing with this idea again that we're seeing cases drop dramatically, and an article saying we're in the lowest since October. We've had one of the most sudden drops we've ever had in cases. So now we're seeing kind of this response around the country where certain states are starting to really kind of release and ease mandates, even mask mandates. So now this is creating a buzz of like, should be releasing, mask mandates. Where are we? We have this looming variants that are always kind of percolating in the background. We don't know what's going to happen. I just want to get your kind of 2 cents of where you think we're at right now. Are we, again, to what extent can we be preparing for a 4th wave soon? And do you think that some of these states releasing mask mandates is a good thing, or should we be a little more cautious as we enter into February and March?
yeah, it's a really interesting time. I mean, like you said, there's I do feel like COVID has been less in the news, and there is a lot of good news, coming out with more and more people getting the vaccine, and just cases dropping so much in so many different places. So I mean, that's all really good. I do think that there's some little bit of concern in the back of my mind, definitely, that as we're thinking about opening back up and releasing mask mandates and these kinds of things, that that we're sort of in that sweet spot where cases are generally going down, but some of the variants are really just starting to pick up and take off in certain places, which is not too different than where the UK was in early December, where they had really brought cases down quite a bit and then they started to surge again. Now, I mean, of course, for all the reasons we've talked about, things are different here than they were in the UK at the time, given that we're sort of emerging from the coronavirus season. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that that we need to be prepared for surges in different places potentially. I know the last couple of weeks I've been saying that I was more expecting sort of a gradual decline in cases rather than any extra surges. But I actually think that since cases have been coming down so quickly, faster than I imagined they would, we might actually see a surge just because we've reached such a low baseline so quickly that when the variants start to emerge now, rather than just extending that tail of infections, we'll actually start seeing bumps in different places as well. So yeah, I think that it's still worth sort of proceeding with caution over the next couple of weeks and months, because there's still a lot that we're learning about the variants. We haven't really had them for a very long time. And we know that they definitely can cause surges of infection, both in places that have and haven't yet seen major outbreaks so far. So I think that, it just really reinforces the importance of doing the surveillance to know where they are, how quickly they're spreading. And I think the main thing is that it's not necessarily bad that we're beginning to release some of these restrictions, but I just think that, again, we need to be mentally prepared to turn them back on if need be, because these things can really, again, it's back to that discussion of exponential growth, and they can really spiral out of control quickly if we're not staying really closely on top of them.
Yeah. It's been a hard position for me as well, just in general, because when I'm going to work and there's no really overt pressure or anything, but besides just the normal kind of social pressure, because I think everybody's just chill about it now. So because, right. And so I'm trying to play the more cautious, not this kind of sense of trying to be hypersensitive, but just trying to wear a mask. But I feel like sometimes I'm the only one, doing it at times. And so then the pressure of like, am I overreacting? And because the variants are just looming for me. I'm like, I'm going to do my best. It's not that big of a deal. So I feel like it's just another one of those hard spots to be in if you're kind of like in the state where like, I'm a little concerned about the variant because it's unknown and it could just raise its ugly head at any moment. And so I'm just trying to be extra protective. But then the pressure is, 6 months ago, most people were kind of wearing masks. You kind of fit in like a sheep pretty well. And now I'm not quite that, I don't know what I am. I'm the wolf. I don't know. Whatever. Yeah. It's just like, it's a hard spot.
Well, yeah. And it's funny because, I mean, some of these conversations sort of keep recurring. Again, I remember that after sort of the first major lockdown or shutdown, whatever it was at the beginning, it was pretty clear, pretty much everybody who could stay home was staying home, and it was pretty, what we were expected to do was relatively clear. And then there was this really weird period of uncertainty where there wasn't a lot of guidance, and everybody was kind of responding in a different way. Where as we entered into the summer, and like, well, what is safe, and trying to look around, and we had all sort of developed our personal habits as we were sort of cloistered in our homes, and then there's suddenly this social negotiation now too, as things start to shift, and I think we're sort of entering into that again now as people are getting vaccinated. And so there's sort of these different groups of people now, in some sense, where, some have been vaccinated, some have not. That sort of changes what people can and can't do. And cases are down. And so people are responding to that fact in different ways. It's this really tricky social negotiation where, again, the habits that we'd built up in sort of this set point that we had reached over the last couple of months is now really shifting in an abrupt way again. It's hard to navigate. And I think like the social pressures, are some of the most difficult to figure out what to do, as we're just like trying to figure out what it means to behave safely and responsibly. And
I think you hit the nail on that, because you were talking. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I think. I'm also feeling this. Another dimension is that I've built new habits in the past year, and it's gonna be really weird to say this, but I don't want to let them go. Like something like I've spent all this year developing these new habits. And I'm like, I don't think I'm ready to go back to normal in certain ways. I mean, in certain ways, clearly, seeing people, having you fly to Denver, go to a pub, hang out, that sounds all great. But other things, I'm like, I'm kind of an introvert, and part of this has been kind of a nice little advantage, right? So I'm like, so there's a lot of mixed emotions going on within my own heart and soul. So I got to figure it myself.
Well, yeah, and I think that's really natural. It's like, I think that there's also this emotional side of things, I think is really interesting, because it does intersect with mental health and physical safety and all of these things, because it's, I've been thinking a lot about like there's I've sort of seen and personally experienced like the whole spectrum of emotion, from like almost like there can be like an element of jealousy when people are like sort of just
Yeah.
living their lives sort of very
Yes.
normally and seeming like it's like everything's going fine. And I feel like, you know, I'm either can't or I'm not willing to. But then in the reverse, there's sort of this perceived sense of like, well, am I being judged for my actions? Am I being sort of um like are people sort of praising me for my actions in ways that I don't really feel like I deserve? Is like so, and so I think that like as we're beginning to navigate this, I think one of the most important things is to recognize that this is just like a really complex thing for all of us, and that something that might seem so crystal clear for the way that I think I ought to behave, um, somebody else's crystal clearness looks entirely different than my own.
Yeah.
And to sort of both be graceful with ourselves and with other people as we're trying to navigate this really complex process, and you know, to not read necessarily too much into what other people are doing and like assigning them these labels of like, oh, they're being reckless, or oh, they're being overcautious, or oh, whatever. You know, it's just like this is just like a really complex space right now, and I think we all need a little bit of grace. So I think yeah, that's my biggest hope as we're moving forward, and that serves the public health aim as well. Like, you know, if we're all comfortable in what we're doing and feel able to communicate with other people and enter into dialogue about this is why I'm behaving how I'm behaving, that serves our ability to control the pandemic much better than it does if we all sort of feel timid about what we're doing and trying to hide our behavior. Or it's so I think that can be really important and something that I'm really trying to keep in mind.
That's great. That's a great. I love that. I mean, just the whole purpose is, you know, I was kind of being reminded of, you know, me reading the scripture passage about, you know, causing meat in the stubble. If you guys ever read it, no big deal. But this whole issue with Corinth about this meat issue, and people were eating this quote unclean meat, and Paul just like, oh gosh, whatever, people. We understand that like meat is just meat. We get it. We can eat it whenever we want to. But you know, some people think it's unclean. Some people think it's not really good. So instead of judging them, instead of like just go with it, uphold their conscience. Don't try to judge them. I think that applies today. I'm like, we may have an idea that, like, you know, we'll talk about this in the second, how back in March and in April, we were seeking to like, don't touch any of the surfaces and keep your mail out for like 3 days. We just didn't know. And then over time we realized, oh, you know what? It's really not a place by which we get it, you know, get COVID. I mean, it's possible, but it's really not probable at all. So, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who still, even our own household, you know, just out of still clean off groceries, and even though it's not really needed, for the sake of the conscience, we just support it, right? Because everybody has their own timeline by which they enter into the world. And the thing that we can do, and by the way, I might be speaking, sounds like I'm speaking to our listeners. I'm pretty much speaking to myself right now. So, so it's just kind of like,
Right.
like I need to be able to walk in the company of the people in a powerful way and allow them to enter back into the world in their own timeline, right? It's going to happen. It's not like that fear that somebody's going to be stuck in a perpetual grocery, Clorox wiping for the next 75 years is really unlikely, right? They're going to enter into the real world. Just allow them that freedom. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay. Well, other things we got to talk about that's important, or at least important to me, because I found it on the news. So let's talk about it. I saw this article, Stephen. Australia is still doing lockdowns the right way. So we got Bruce, our good friend. I haven't heard from him in a while. I sent him an email. Love to hear back what's going on in Australia. Australia seems to be kind of like this beacon of light, oftentimes, for how they're doing things. I'm not sure whether that's a right judgment or a bad or the wrong judgment, but they keep coming back into this circle of conversation. So I just want to know what's been talked about in your neck of the woods right now when it comes to looking at Australia lockdowns, how they've dealt with it, and whether good or bad, and how that might be a lesson for us in epidemiology and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like I'm glad you brought this up, because I think this ties into some of the stuff we were talking about before. Again, way back when there were sort of these different notions of flatten the curve and crush the curve, and we were trying to figure out like what should we be doing here?
And
in some ways exactly
yeah,
right. Yeah, and I think in some ways, the United States and many other countries and Australia sort of took different tacks on that in the way that Australia really went after the crush the curve thing. They went after it
intensely,
and have succeeded in that largely. Of course, I think again, it's like there are so many things that make the United States different than Australia, but nevertheless, I mean, Australia is a very big country, has major cities, has substantial international connectivity. And so there are, I think that there are lessons to be learned there. I think one of the most thought-provoking messages that I've seen. I have a colleague who's in Australia and was just talking about the fact that, like, he had, it was a weekend and he had just been to 2 parties, out to dinner, and he was about to go to, like, some other social gathering, and that's like, there's hardly any COVID cases there. And so what the point that he made was that, like, I hear so many people talking about how strict pandemic control is antithetical to freedom. And he's like, I just don't understand what this means. Cause, like, look at me, I'm like living a very free life that's been enabled by the fact that, there were these relatively strict pandemic controls early on, but now they're sort of reaping the benefits of that. And so, I mean, everybody sort of has to choose their own path to some extent. But it seems like we've sort of, like, chosen 2 different approaches to controlling the pandemic. And that's just sort of the place that we're at. Now, of course, one of the other big benefits of having cases really low is that when you don't have much virus circulating, there's less possibility of variants evolving and emerging as well. Sure. So that's one of the great benefits, going back to the conversation we were having before about whether we should let up or whether we should really continue with our control measures, is that if we sort of keep allowing COVID to sort of bubble along at this level, then that increases the chances of variants emerging and spreading. And so there's also a public health benefit in that sense of really reducing cases as low as we can. So I think that it's, there are so many different ways to control the epidemic. And again, I really want to reinforce that, like, there's the countries are just different too. There are different aspects in play, and some of the things that might have been possible in Australia may not have been possible here. Sure. But nevertheless, I think that there are useful things to learn there. And it seems like, again, that very strict control early on really did allow them to enjoy certain types of freedoms that we're still sort of can't yet hear.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And I mean, I'm curious, I want to go deeper into Australia at some point in time, because maybe Bruce can chime in at some point in time and help us understand how things are going on. But, you hear things like really strict lockdowns for like 4 months during a peak time of in Australia. And I don't know which city, where it was at. And so, because of the polemics that go on here in the US, one of the first things that comes to mind is like, well, then how are the restaurants and, being funded? How are they being compensated? Like all these kind of things to help people. And so they may have a different paradigm by which I have no idea. But, like, I'm curious to know, when they do over and over these lockdowns, how are they being cared for? It sounds like they are, because when my one dude I know, Bruce, right? It's a very small sampling. That sounds like that overall people are okay with it, which means there must be some compensation to help them get through. So I'm curious to know how this works. Another obsession of mine, Stephen, we've talked about this now. Now, we didn't talk about it last week. I brought it up. We weren't ready to talk about it. I'm being more obsessed with this. This article comes from a couple days ago, the Washington Post, why you can get a cold even while masking and taking other COVID-19 precautions. So, Stephen, you have some things you want to contribute to this conversation. I have some things I want to contribute. The reason why I'm fascinated with this is because, I'm just getting obsessed with surfaces and viruses. Not like wearing. I don't care about it. I totally get it. I don't. If it was up to me, I wouldn't wash my stuff. I wouldn't wear gloves. I get the balance. But just, I'm fascinated by how some viruses we're concerned about with actually being on surfaces, COVID were not. And so in my mind, my small little feeble mind, I'm trying to figure out how to wrap my head between different kinds of viruses and how they are can be hard for us on surfaces and be contagious and otherwise not. So back in the day, I worked at Starbucks. Good old coffee, loved it, loved my time there, have some great friends that I still think about all the time. And one of the things they talked about, a good cup of coffee, they made it simple for us, just 3 dimensions. It's like, of course, it's the coffee bean, right? You got a good, solid coffee bean. But it's not just that, it's the grind, the quality of the grind. That's the second variable. And the third one was, of course, with water, right? You got a good filtered water. If you don't have filtered water, it tastes like chlorine. You're going to get it in the coffee. It's not going to taste like a real good cup of coffee. And that's carried with me up to this day. So now I'm taking this and I'm like, okay, what are like the 3 dimensions, Stephen, of a virus on surfaces where we can say, okay, this is why, right? COVID, we're not that concerned about. Whereas, like, we heard about the rhinovirus. The rhinovirus is still it's raising its ugly head. It's surpassing mask mandates, and they're probably contributed because of probably surfaces. We're getting them from surfaces, and that's where it's at. So I'm fascinated about this, of how do I understand the mystery of how these work? And, like, I've heard like C. diff, or, very aggressive. It sounds like it can stay on surfaces for like flipping ever. And, and how many particles do you need to get contagious? It's so I want information about this. So I would love for you just to vomit whatever knowledge you have to help me understand this complexity of the situation and how these things spread.
Yeah. So, I mean, probably the clearest analog with viruses, as you've said, with your sort of three axes that we're talking about, are things that we have talked about. It's like surfaces, droplets, and aerosols, right? Like that's sort of the way that we think about like the different ways in which viruses can spread, and different viruses have different, each of those has sort of a different importance. And so I think that as we've been learning more about COVID, it's really interesting because SARS-CoV-2, we've sort of really shifted all the way from one axis to the other, where we really thought that like, maybe surfaces are really important. And that was partly informed by what we know about flu, where surfaces can be very important. They were like, well, surfaces probably not so much, but mainly droplets. And now it's like droplets. Well, actually, really aerosols are kind of the things that we, the things that we really need to worry about. And it's just as we've been learning more and more about the virus, we've been sort of clarifying that. But you're right. Each virus has sort of a different type of behavior that has to do with just how stable the virus is and what it needs to sort of thrive. And you can think of all sorts of different viruses, that, there's all sorts of, like, you can imagine like the Ebola virus, for example, which is generally, the main mode of transmission is through direct contact with bodily fluids, right? So that's an entirely different, like that requires a really special kind of contact. And other, mosquito transmitted viruses, for example, they're you need to get bit by a bug, and the virus can't really persist like outside of the body, these kinds of things are, so it's like, it's very complex. But that has to do with viruses. And of course, viruses aren't the only things that cause colds either. We have bacteria as well. And bacteria sort of obey entirely different types of life as well, and different ways of sort of maintaining their stability inside and outside of the body. So getting back to your original question, right? So we were asking about like, what is it? We're wearing masks and we can still get sick. What gives? Like, what is it? Why is this? And so part of it is, of course, yes. So things can persist on surfaces. Flu can persist on surfaces, and so we can pick it up. You touch a contaminated doorknob, and then you adjust your mask or something, and all of a sudden you've given yourself a pretty decent inoculum, and you can get sick. But one of the other things is that a lot of bacteria, for example, are what we call commensal bacteria. They're things that generally just sort of live happily on our skin or in our respiratory tract or in our digestive system. But then certain things can happen that basically make them angry and cause what we call invasive disease. So Streptococcus Pneumoniae is sort of like this. It lives in our noses, in our ears, and generally doesn't really cause much of an issue. But strep pneumo is I think the leading cause of ear infections in young kids. And so sometimes it just kind of makes that move and becomes an invasive form of strep pneumo. And then you get a cold, you get an ear infection, you get a fever, whatever. And it doesn't even necessarily have to come from an external infection, although oftentimes it does. But sometimes it can just sort of be something that happens within your body too. Our bodies are so incredibly complex in that, like, we have, there's a lot of research now in the microbiome, which is essentially all the little bugs and critters that live on us and in us that also help constitute who we are. Like that's the whole idea behind probiotics, for example, too, that like, there's this whole microbiome that's living in your gut that's like doing things for you. It's like helping you like break down certain types of food, and some of it is really beneficial, but then some of it can cause disease, and a lot of it just doesn't really do anything at all, and it just kind of hangs out. But all of that is sort of in play here. And so sort of this traditional paradigm that we have, where there's this invader that invades and causes disease, and then our body fights a battle and gets rid of it. There's a lot of sort of complexity to that too. And while that serves well enough for sort of a high level picture of how infectious diseases work, there's a lot else going on under the surface that can cause illness or health that is worth us paying attention to. So.
That's great. I think this is important. Maybe it's only for a fringe audience for this, but for those of us who have been at some point in time in like a pretty intense lockdown for maybe 2 or 3 months, and then you get sick. I've had it where a couple of friends like, how on earth does this happen? Like, and so what happens is I see this fear of like, did a mysterious like virus penetrate our walls? And if that's it, what's next? These militant viruses, like knowing that I'm at home and knocking on my door, and that it really. And then we talked to a doctor who said something similar. Like, it's complicated because there are things that just stay on you, and then one day they want to raise their ugly head out of nowhere, and the whole family could get sick, and you may have not have spoken to a single soul in person or left your even house for a month, and you can still get sick. It's not because of a random package necessarily. It could just be, hey, something became active. And that's as simple as that. It happens. That's life.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. I had a question, though. Another one. Do you know, like, when it comes to COVID, we know that it's a certain amount of virus that's needed before we're actually infected. Is that typical for, I'm guessing, for all viruses, and that fluctuates? Like, some you may only need, quote, a particle, whatever, like one small little thing, and man, you're just gone. Others, you need a lot. So is it true that some things, it could be a very small and it just gets you going, and others you need a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's interesting. I was actually just looking at this the other day. I was trying to figure out sort of what the infectious dose was for SARS-CoV-2.
Okay.
And it looks like, based off of some really interesting contact tracing and genetic sequencing data that people have been working on, it looks like on average the infectious dose for SARS-CoV-2 is on the order of 1,000 viral particles. Okay. It can be infectious probably at lower doses as well. They documented some infections that might have happened as low as 100 or so, 50 to 100 particles. But it seemed like on average, people generally got a dose of about 1,000 particles from the person who they got it from. The sort of on the other end of the super infectious spectrum, one of the viruses, for example, that I usually think about like that's able to infect you just like on a dime is Norovirus, which usually causes gastrointestinal distress, and you can get it from eating contaminated foods, but that thing can infect you with I think as few as 2 or 3 viral particles. Like, you barely need any of it, and it will just like make you feel like crap, really bad for a couple of days. I speak from experience. So this is kind of a funny anecdote, actually. So I was at a conference for infectious disease researchers last year, and we were. So everybody was giving these talks about infectious diseases, and there were a couple talks about norovirus, and there was actually. We sort of, as part of the conference, we were sort of, we could volunteer to partake in this study where we would have like small bits of our blood drawn, and then they would like look for antibodies in the blood to try to understand sort of what we'd been exposed to previously in our life. And at this conference of infectious disease researchers, there was this huge outbreak of norovirus, something that we ate. It's like, I think it was at the conference dinner, it was like the second to last night. And then the next day, all of us woke up with like fever, night sweats. Like, we were all just like really rough. It was just like the irony of ironies. And so, anyway, hopefully that wasn't actually planned as part of the conference as a way of sort of like getting closer to our research, but I think not. So anyway, it's super infectious. A lot of us came down with it. So it was really it was funny to see like this like epidemiological community. We were all like staggering around out of our rooms, but like we were trying to figure out like what happened, where did it come from, like how many of us are getting infected, what's the reproduction number of this? It's ridiculous. So
I feel like that like literally is like a milestone of your life that prepared you for COVID, because like you're like nope, this is not going to happen with me. COVID, I'm never going to leave my apartment. I'm just going to go out for brief walks, get takeout, and I'll see my university in about a year or so again. Like, I feel like it's like totally painted exactly how you're handling it. I will not have this happen twice. Oh man, that's great. So I'm just curious. So with the other one you just said, Norovirus, does it also subsist on surfaces longer than like COVID? So it's like a double whammy, like small particles. Right. So that's like a very intense one. Okay, good to know. Random. Just wanted to say again, I love the flu stats. I'm just mesmerized by this. I'm not going to talk about it. I saw it by the NPR post. I think it was NPR on a tweet that mentioned like since October, there's been 165 hospitalizations. I think that was it. I'm not looking at it right now. And then normally we'd have 400,000. So 165 currently to date, normally 400,000 hospitalizations. That's intense. That's crazy. So all that being saying, good job for those of us, to everyone trying to work with COVID and do the best to protect everyone, because even though it may look complicated and a lot of people may not be wearing masks that we're talking about, nonetheless, it's still having a big impact, and we see that reflected in the flu. Okay. Next article I want to chat with you about. This article called COVID Absolutism from the New York Times. And we just addressed this idea of people, or I think, I don't know if it was San Francisco, or I don't have it in front of me right now. I think it was there, someplace in California City, really imposing some pretty strong mandates. Wearing masks, of course, but wearing masks out running, outside, even by yourself, all these things, it's just constant mandates. And just, it was basically suggesting in a very intense way that, like, this is, number one, unnecessary and will most likely backfire. And I wanted to get your feedback on this. I'm just thinking of me in productivity and task management. I was talking about this. It's like due dates. For those of you who use task management and the only thing you have is the due date in there, what you often will do is you'll put a due date for things that are actually due. And then things like, oh, you know what? I'd like to exercise tomorrow, so due tomorrow, right? Exercise. And then you end up being tomorrow. It's not really a due date, so then you postpone it. But then when you lump and you put due dates on everything, the real due dates get lost in the mess. Now due dates are now suggestions, and then you become overdue on things that are important. I feel like that's kind of similar, like what's going on with my mindset of this. Like when you impose this all over, then mask in general lose its intensity. And then when you, like we've learned over a period of time, that willpower is finite. We wake up usually refreshed, and by the end of the day, we're exhausted. That's why it's best to work out in the morning when you have a good, strong willpower. And it's why you go for the donut at 6 p.m. instead of the actual exercise, speaking from a human experience, because you're exhausted and you're stressed and you don't exercise. And so you end up just, falling from this. And so that we're doing this, we impose this all over the place when it's not necessary, like outside. I'm pretty laxed personally when it comes outside. I really don't do much. I mean, I don't get in people's faces either. I stay across the other side of the sidewalk, but I don't wear masks, but boys don't wear masks. I feel like it's okay, but I do wear them in the important places, inside, especially in close quarters. But if you're always wearing all the time, you get fatigued, you get exhausted, and then then the one time you should have worn it, you're just too tired, you wear it, and you get infected. I just want to get your thoughts. Is that a similar train of thought that you've been having and discussing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always it's always a difficult balance to strike, but one that we're always aiming for as epidemiologists and people who are involved in public health. It's you're right. Like it's based on everything we know, like being outdoors and being relatively distanced from people is like pretty safe. And generally like not wearing a mask when you're out for a run, as long as you're not like, ghosting somebody and like running right up behind them for like 20 minutes, like as long as you're not kind of being a weirdo anyway, like, it's like
totally.
It's probably going to be okay. And so and so it's really tricky because there's this fine balance though, because there's as an epidemiologist, a lot of the feedback that I hear comes from two different perspectives. One of them is, we'll try to communicate something and it's like, well, that's just too complicated. Just tell me what I need to do and make it simple. Like, why do you have to make it so complicated? Just give me some simple rules and I'll follow them and then that'll be fine. But then, with something, okay, so I'll give you a simple rule. Masks everywhere, masks outside, masks when you're running, just wear a mask all the time. And then it's like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, I need to, like, that's just too much. And clearly, and rightfully so, it's not, you don't need that. We don't need that. And people can, rightly, like, people are not dumb, right? They can see like what's effective and what's not, and can see if like something that they're being asked to do doesn't actually match up with something that would be effective at controlling disease. And so I think, the best thing we can do is just keep communicating sort of the nuances and complexity of the situation, and trust people to make good decisions for themselves. And I think that that's the best we can do. So you're right. I think that the sort of blanket rules that can be made that aren't necessarily grounded in really good infection control strategies can absolutely backfire, both because people rightfully recognize that what they're being asked to do is not useful, and it sort of erodes trust too, because they're like, well, why do you ask me to do that if it's not actually founded in science and in our understanding of how disease spreads? Now, of course, there are certain circumstances where the other variable that we have to pay attention to here is limited knowledge. And so that was one of the things that was really prevalent, of course, early in the pandemic, and why sort of widespread lockdowns, uniform masking, all of that made a lot of sense then, because we didn't really know what we were dealing with. And all we knew was that COVID could decimate a city in a matter of weeks. And we didn't know where it was, when it was going to happen. And, and so in that sense, we didn't know what the right interventions were, but we also knew that this was potentially catastrophic and we needed to do everything we could to stop it. Now our understanding is a lot more nuanced. And so I think that we can be a lot more targeted in our interventions. And I think we need to be to maintain trust and to make sure that people are, as you said, actually using masks when they're inside in crowds around lots of people in the places where they're going to be most effective.
That's great. I mean, yeah, you're showing the complexity of the situation. It's kind of like math, you're a kindergartner and you learn basic 101. We're working with our oldest with math. He's doing a great job with addition and subtraction. And he may think they may solve the world's problems, but actually you need more than math. And eventually you need stats and then DiffyQ and matrix theory and all these different things that help with complexity. And you realize that you start with the simple things. And it's kind of like that's just how the human mind works. We bite down on something that's actually digestible right away, gets us going. And it might be overly simplistic. And when we've mastered it, we want what's next? What's the nuance? It's the the basic art class in kindergarten to the artist, and who has the ability to shift and be nuanced. But, so all those complexities are needed for this whole process. Great. We only have a few more minutes before we got to end so we can move on to other things in our own life. But one thing, variants. I want to talk to you about that. Just what's your updates on variants? You're discussing it right now. You've been real busy this week talking about variants. What's the scoop? What do we see? I hear the U.S. has some more variants. Anything concerning on your horizon, and what's the update?
Yeah, so we've been thinking a lot about the variants for sure. And again, there's more information is coming out little by little, suggesting that many of the vaccines are still effective against preventing severe disease caused by potentially the variants, even if the variants are able to escape some level of vaccine effectiveness for mild and moderate disease. So that's still by and large good news. As you said, there's this recent study by Emma Hodcroft and her colleagues, and in many ways she's the guru of SARS-CoV-2 genetic epidemiology. So it is still a preprint, but it's a preprint that I'm certainly going to pay close attention to, and I would encourage others to as well if you're interested in these sorts of things. And they've basically identified another key mutation that they've picked up that seems to be associated with increased receptor binding. So again, that's similar to the B117 variant that we saw in the UK. That might allow the virus to be a little bit more infectious, though through a slightly different mutation that's involved. So I think that's something, again, that we're paying close attention to. We're going to keep seeing these things pop up. There will be a number of false alarms. There will be things that will be concerning for a while, and then we'll just sort of peter out. And that can either be because they aren't actually more infectious or because they are, but the randomness of the way that this disease spreads just caused them to die out anyway. Like both of those things are possible. And so I think we sort of need to buckle up and recognize that like some of these are going to be important. Some of them aren't. We're going to be hearing a lot about these in the coming weeks. And to sort of just try to maintain that middle ground of sort of sobriety without panic, of understanding that there's that these things are worth paying attention to and are things that we're going to have to contend with in the coming months. But again, we also know largely how to prevent this virus's spread, and it might require special effort at different times in different places, and I think we need to be prepared for that for sure. But I think we're past the stage where we really need to panic about these things. We kind of know what's expected of us, and the most important thing is to just kind of pay attention to what's emerging and how cases are going in your given community, and just to do our best to maintain what we've been doing all along.
Great. Random question. We may have addressed this before, but I have had a couple people ask me, with the variants, so far to this point, does that mean people can get reinfected right away, or are they not so strong enough to where the first natural immunity seems to cover these variants as well?
That's a great question. I don't think we know that yet. My impulse would be that probably very soon after infection, sort of the huge B cell response that you get after an initial infection will probably protect you more broadly from coronaviruses for a little while, including the variants. But that obviously wears off, such that you can get reinfected with similar coronavirus variants, and now we have these other variants that might be more effective at immune escape. So I imagine it's probably not immediate. You probably at least have a couple weeks window in which you're pretty well protected. Okay. So I imagine there's some amount of time there that needs to pass.
Great. That reminds me, we may not be able to get into this today, but I wanted to just ask you quickly. I saw an article about this, about how, I think it was from The Atlantic, about how our immune response seems to be can be even better than the initial infection. And so it's talking about idea that how it can actually, so here's my equivalent. I'm just put it in my layman's terms. Does the immune response have like a fuzzy search option? You know, it's kind of like where you do like a, you know, like in like certain things like Google, you put in a, you know, you might be a grammatical variant basically, right? But it's enough to figure out, oh yeah, you mistyped that and here's the actual result, the same solution. Does the immune response have like fuzzy search where like, here's COVID, but here's a rough model so that could handle some sense of variance on its own?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so that's, you know, because what the immune system is targeted to is really just like it's the shape of the virus and it's the shape of certain parts of the virus. And as long as that's close enough, then even with some mutations, then the immune system can still recognize something that's not right and mount a similar immune response that will still be mostly effective against that. So I think that's a really good analog. It's doing essentially the same thing. It's looking for sort of a different grammatical structure, but trying to figure out what exactly you meant.
That's awesome. Can you write some kind of scientific article about that and call it fuzzy search? I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
That'd be awesome. It'll be out next week. We'll let you know. Steve, will you send me the article for the pre-pub you were just talking about?
Yep.
Any information about that girl, I think that lady, that we can direct them to check.
Yeah,
check
absolutely. Everybody follow her on Twitter and stop listening to me and start listening to her.
Yeah, whatever. I was totally random, but I was using my Twitter a little more because I was like, I kind of like it. It's fun. And so I looked you up and I followed you, which is funny. I haven't been following you. And I hit the list option, but there was no lists that you had. I'm like, do you have lists that are public that I can or no on Twitter?
Interesting. I didn't even know that was possible, but
Okay,
I'll take a look.
Well, I'm going to work with this with Steven. He's going to compile a list of people he follows on Twitter, and then we'll make it public. Yeah. You can follow their list. We'll work on that together. Okay. That's about it. A couple other things just to say. There's looks like maybe Dr. Fauci said in September that there might be kids might be able to get the vaccine, and that's all the big breaking news. Thank you guys so much for listening. I greatly appreciate it. We'll be back next Monday with a great episode. And again, if you want to reach out to Stephen, STEPHENKASSLER on Twitter. I just now followed him after so many years. And if you want to support us, patreon.com/pandemic podcast. Those are $5 a month. Or one-time payment at Venmo, PayPal, all in the show notes. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful and great week. We will see you next week. Take care and bye-bye.